All right, so we're going to step outside the SEC for a game this week. There's a lot of a lot of teams with buys this week in the SEC, so we're going to jump into Notre Dame USC. It's a huge game every year. Even when these teams are down, they tend to make it a pretty big game. So we're excited to talk about this one. And for you USC and Notre Dame fans who usually don't watch our channel or our videos, we encourage you to give us your score prediction in the comments and let us know where you think we got it wrong, where you think we got it right. We'll engage you and have a discussion in the comments about the game. The video is just the start. The rest of the week, we love to talk with y'all about what our numbers say and what we think is going to happen in the game. So, with that being said, we've already done one Notre Dame game this year. It was a Notre Dame-Georgia game, and we picked Georgia in that game. But our takeaways from this game were that we really liked some things we saw from Notre Dame that were improvement from previous years, namely even last year, the 4-8 season. And we came out of that game saying this is not a 4-8 team this year. Namely, one of the things we really love about Notre Dame is they don't have particularly, when you compare them to other elite teams like Georgia this year, they don't have the athletes and the sheer athleticism and the top five, recruiting at every position players, but they make up for and neutralize a lot of opponents, abilities by playing super smart and very sound on defense, which allows them to play actually really fast. So we like Notre Dame. We want to do another game for them, and this is, as good as any. So let's get into this a little bit. Notre Dame had a bye week last week. USC had a game against Utah, 28-27, that wasn't pretty, but they came away late with the win. So let's talk a little bit about where both these teams are at this year headed into this game, which can lead us into what we can expect.
USC and Notre Dame both have a kind of similar issue, I think, in that they've played a couple really good teams and they've played a lot of teams that aren't so good. And for those that haven't listened, we've talked a lot about the fact that college football as a whole is really losing parity. We last year really railed on the Big Ten at times because the Big Ten had gotten to the point where you had three teams that were competing: Penn State and Ohio State and Michigan with the rest of the conference. But those three teams combined lost one game to the rest of the conference. Right? Michigan's bizarre game where they had a starting quarterback injured and lost to Iowa. And outside that, they completely dominated everybody else. And all their wins were propped up by the fact that you had competition that we knew really wasn't even capable of competing with the rest of the conference, meaning those top three teams. But they played against each other and kind of ended up middling. This year, I think, honestly, we've been very critical of the SEC. We think they have the same problem. Up until this bizarre Auburn LSU game, it really seemed like no one in the SEC was capable of challenging Auburn, Alabama, or Georgia, and I think maybe this one is even going to go down as a little bit of an aberration, the Auburn LSU game. But every conference is kind of dealing with that. I think conference expansion did a ton against it. That you when we added teams, you generally added teams that were below average for what the conference had up previously. And everybody's getting a lot more easy wins, which means it's harder to compare because there's fewer good teams on the schedule. And so we kind of have to sort of spot check a little bit. I think in Notre Dame's case, I think the Georgia close loss looks really good in hindsight. And I know we probably upset some Notre Dame fans because we're really critical going into that game of how it was going to turn out. But I hope maybe in retrospect they appreciate the model we run and the things we said, because the truth was Georgia was just a really darn good football team, and there was nothing by any means to take out of that game that was so bad. It was just that Georgia was really, really good. We felt even better about them coming out of it. I think Georgia left some stuff on the board, but I think a lot of that was due to the fact that Notre Dame does have a fair amount of athleticism defensively. I mean, they're a talented team, like sort of like Daniel was saying. I mean, there's a difference between being talented and being top five talented at each position. That latter bar is really hard to make to hit. I think USC is probably really talented at certain positions and really not as talented in others. And it's kind of weird to me because I think there's a lot of positions where USC is got talent that Notre Dame just doesn't have on their roster. And I think there's a lot of bread and butter positions where USC is somewhat deficient. Maybe the offensive line is not really all that great. And when you look at things like depth, Defensively, I think there's some issues where they don't have the sort of bread and butter players you need to have the physicality to win a game and to keep things good throughout the course of the season. So, at this point, you look back on it, and Notre Dame. I think we basically we have a basis because of the Georgia game, and USC. One, I don't think Stanford's a very good football team. I just don't. I think they're pretty deficient. I think the Pac-12 is probably really top heavy, like again, like almost every other conference right now. Washington State, I think they can do things they cannot. The last week's loss really takes a lot off the shine of at least a close game with Washington State. And I think USC probably has a lot more issues that have been shown because they haven't played teams that are particularly good. So I do think this is an interesting game. I think Notre Dame probably has more edges than people realize, and it'll be interesting to sort of work through it.
Tell me if you think this is fair. Notre Dame fans don't love that we bring up 2012 Notre Dame a lot. But what our big criticism for 2012 Notre Dame was that they weren't the second best or first best team in the country. They were playing and getting wins against a lot of 7-6 type teams where they were winning those games, had a clean record, they were winning them close. And if you have a one-off where you struggle, that's not a big deal. But if you have a consistent struggle against middling teams, you're probably not that great. It's funny because we're seeing a little bit of the reverse of that for Notre Dame this year, but a lot of that for USC. So USC's got some ugly, close, or closer than they should be wins against some okay teams. And Notre Dame, while they're not playing a ton of top line talent, they're blowing people out of the water, which is something we haven't seen from Notre Dame in the past. And that to me says a lot of good. Is there something there with looking at, maybe we don't see a lot of top 5 matchups, but how they play against the average or poor competition?
I think potentially. Now, to sort of backtrack a bit there, the 2012 Notre Dame, our criticism with that team was, yeah, they went undefeated and they had a good win against Oklahoma, but they had way too many very close wins against teams they should blow out. And it wasn't just that it happened once or twice, it happened the entire season, which makes you start to think that they're a little bit better than those other teams. If you want to win in the playoffs, you've got to show that there's a pretty significant distance from you and the people you play. Because I think everybody's sort of seen this at this point. There is those top 5 teams in the country are kind of on a different level, and anybody can win any given week. Totally understand that. It's absolutely true. Football is an asymmetric game. You have so many plays like turnovers and fumbles and kicks, and you can have one little screen pass, a guy takes a bad step, you give up a touchdown. It's really easy to get points that aren't really necessarily tied to how good you are, but by and large things come back to average. However, all that said, I do take a lot from the fact they had a close loss against Georgia. I think that was really good. I like the fact that they're beating up on bad teams, but I think you also have to accept that they have beat up on bad teams. Michigan State got the win over Michigan. That was a solid win. I think in theory, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much it really means. A close win over Minnesota, a close win over Iowa. I'm not sure those are great teams. I think Michigan may just be a little bit overrated. I think Notre Dame fans probably won't hate to hear that. I like the fact that they beat these teams by large margins, but I also think the only team they've played that is probably maybe even a top 50 team is Georgia. I mean, Michigan State might be in that realm. I say top 50. Let's go top 30, top 35. North Carolina and Boston College are pretty darn poor teams, and I think Michigan State is probably a little bit overrated. Temple, Miami of Ohio are both atrocious. Yeah, so I think I don't take any bad signs from that. They've done what they should have done against bad teams, and they played really well in a last possession game against a very good one in Georgia. But USC, yeah, I'm concerned. I'm with you because you look down that schedule. Western Michigan's not very good, and they had to put them away at the end of the game. They beat Stanford soundly, but they're not alone in that category. Stanford has looked like a shaky team this year. Should have lost to Texas, frankly, and I know they came back and won that game. But from a play-to-play perspective, I mean, Texas was darn close to putting that away, and they sustain one little play here or there, and they lose that game. It's a little bit like NC State missing a field goal last year against Clemson, in that it's a game that you can say they got out with a W, and I appreciate that. But in terms of future predictions, maybe I don't know how to take it. The close game against Cal, lost to Washington State. They beat Oregon State team, who probably is in the running for the worst Power 5 team in the country. And then they get a 1-point win against Utah that was just ultra close. And there were some things that kind of went against Utah in that game that would have allowed maybe Utah to win it. So yeah, there's a lot of question marks about USC. They have not played a particularly tough schedule. The one team that I think may actually be pretty good in Washington State, they lost, and the rest of them are all probably should be unranked teams. So that's really concerning. And I think for both teams, at least for Notre Dame, this is the second time they're going to play a really good opponent, and they looked good in that other game. USC, this is either the first or the second. Maybe Washington State's another, but Notre Dame is a completely different team than Washington State, a lot more talented across the board. Honestly, USC has not played any team this season that has this level of athleticism consistently, and really no one that's even close to Notre Dame, in my opinion, in terms of front seven and their ability to cause disruption and really control the line of scrimmage. Washington State may be able to rush the passer some and give them issues. Washington State is not anywhere close to what Notre Dame has in the front seven.
And two games that stick out to me for USC, and USC fans are going to hate us, but this, we're being honest about what we see this year. Yes, you have a 6-1 pretty clean record, but you haven't played anybody yet. The Cal game, 30-20 over Cal, 10-point win. You had to score 17 points in the fourth quarter to beat a Cal team that only scored 27 against Ole Miss. And to put that into perspective, Ole Miss just gave up 35 to Vanderbilt, which is easily the worst offense in the SEC. And Alabama scored 66 on Ole Miss, could have scored 166 if they wanted to. So Cal's offense, not great. Not great at all. And you gave up 20 there. The other one is Oregon State. Oregon State looks really good on paper for a win for USC, 38-10, until you realize that Colorado State beat them 58-27. I think we're seeing some issues with Sam Darnold being consistent. We know he's got all the talent in the world, and if he catches fire, it's over. I mean, you're going to put up 50 points. The problem is we're in week 8 now, and we haven't seen that yet from USC to where we feel like they could steamroll average competition, which gives us a little pause when they're up against what we think is a pretty good Notre Dame team. So let's go ahead and get into the numbers, because I think there's some more discussion to be had with the information of what the computer model says. So tell us what you're seeing in the computer model in terms of score and averages and anything that stands out.
Okay, first, I probably should take a second to sort of explain this because it's going to be new to both teams, I think. We did the Notre Dame Georgia preview. We were kind of harsh on Notre Dame. We're being less harsh now. I hope you appreciate that we say everything we say relative to your opponent, because you can be really good compared to a bad team and maybe have a lot of deficiencies compared to a good one. We do a model, and our model is designed to give you the statistical expectation of the game. It uses per play stats, not total yardage, because we don't really like total yardage because it's so dependent on tempo and scheme. We look at how you did against your opponents versus how your opponents did against everybody else they played. So we set a baseline of how much, for example, what is your statistical defensive percentages allowed in terms of opponent averages, not how many yards per play did you give up, but how much of a percentage did you allow versus what your opponents did on everyone else. And then we use that as a baseline to sort of compare you to the other team and say, okay, we know how much Notre Dame does in most games. We know how you do relative to your opponents. How should that translate to Notre Dame? And then when we get a lot fancier is we take that and we kind of plot it. We use normal curves and some fancy formulas to say, okay, we know how you did when you had 5 yards per play and 6 yards per play and 7 yards per play. How should this map to that curve in terms of points in production? Because when you get 4 yards per play, maybe you score 24 points. And when you get 6 yards per play, maybe you score 45. It doesn't translate 1-to-1 because your ability to move the sticks goes up so much greater. Okay, everything out of the way there. The nature of this game is that really USC's defense struggles. And Notre Dame's defense is pretty solid, but USC's offense is a little bit better than Notre Dame's offense in a lot of ways, but not as good in the run. And USC's given up 99% of opponent averages running the ball, 96% of opponent averages passing the ball. And where we set the bars, we want to say anything from 95 to 100 is average to poor nationally. And if you're a Power 5 team, that's poor because everybody's got in their statistics a lot of group of 5 opponents that sort of boost their statistics. So for example, with USC allowing 99% of opponent rush averages, they're allowing as many yards per carry as teams like when Oregon State played Colorado State. Um, it's similar. Like you factor that in, all their average opponents they're about the same. That's not a good mark. 96% still. You need to distinguish yourself from the group of 5 opponents. You should be above average for their schedule to be a decent defense. Notre Dame, anything 90 to 95 is solid. Anything 85 to 90 we consider to be pretty darn good. Notre Dame's in that mark in both categories, 87% against the rush, 87% against the pass. That is not elite, frankly. That is pretty darn good, but not elite. They're a solid defensive unit, might be more than solid. They are not on the level of some of the really good defenses nationally. They're not at Ohio State. They're not at Clemson, but they're more than good enough to slow down a pretty good defense, and probably a lot better than anything USC's seen to this point. So when you take that all together, we run all our numbers. What are the predictions it comes out to? Well, it seems to say that Notre Dame should be able to run the ball extremely well, 6.8 yards per carry. Shouldn't probably be able to throw it well at all, which isn't charting with Wimbush. 5.5 yards per attempt. So it's unusual to ever see a yard per carry number higher than yard per attempt number, but that's what we've got here. USC should be able to run for about 4.3 yards per carry, but should only pass for about 6.9 yard per attempt, which is kind of rough. We balance in run pass ratios, and you end up with about 5.7 yards per play to 6.25 for Notre Dame. So Notre Dame outgains USC. And then when you plot that and look at past results, and we do our fancy math, that comes out to a prediction of Notre Dame 36, USC 30. So based off their past performances, how they are relative to each other on paper, your statistical prediction is that Notre Dame should be better than USC, and you end up with a predictive score with Notre Dame about a 1 touchdown favorite.
And it's one thing we have to take into consideration is whether or not Wimbush plays. So he didn't play against North Carolina, and they had a bye week. I think he did come back and participate in practice, which is a good sign. The concern I have is that when you have a foot or leg injury to a mobile quarterback who contributes a lot to your ability to have those rush averages, that's your entire offense in terms of being in sync and being able to have your running backs be successful. It keys off of having a quarterback who can run the ball as well and can throw the ball. So I think if you've got Wimbush in there at all, because he may not even play, but if he does play and he's hobbled and he has to be a statue quarterback, we saw that with Kelly in Clemson against Syracuse. It was a big problem. So I think everything that we talk about in terms of score and prediction has to be looked through 2 lenses. One, whether or not if Wimbush plays and is healthy, or if he doesn't play or isn't healthy. So any thoughts on that, and kind of what you think in terms of the score based on what we see here? Like, is the model right, or is it crazy?
Well, I think first you deal with the quarterback issue. That's a wild card, and our statistics can't take into account injury, or they probably could. Our model is designed to be as objective as possible. I don't use weighted averages. I don't use constants. Every number that gets plugged into the model we run comes from some aspect of historical data. The problem with that is when you have a quarterback injury, I don't have anything I can plug in to account for the loss of the quarterback. And I don't want to, because if I say, well, the backups, whether he's going to be good or not, maybe I could use that one game as sample, but that's probably not a very good sample size. I could use recruiting ratings, but then I have to weight how much recruiting ratings should matter. And then, whether you have good recruiting doesn't necessarily mean you've recruited a good quarterback. We've seen that with Alabama. So it, it's tough, and you have to give it with a grain of salt, and we can't model that. But I do think it matters. I think Ian Book really struggled against a pretty poor North Carolina defense, right, with 4.7 yards per attempt. And that's a bad sign. And Book, I don't think, is the runner that Wimbush does. And like you said, Kelly showed how much of an issue that could be. But let's sort of step back a bit and say how this matters. I think a lot of this is really going to be USC's offense versus Notre Dame's defense, and the fact that it's going to be probably a good step higher than they've seen. Texas is solid defensively, but I think as Maryland showed, they could be pushed around a little bit more than you might like. Here is my takeaway from the Utah game. Sam Darnold threw 50 passes in that game at 7.2 yards per attempt. And to an extent, he won the game late, but Ronald Jones III was averaging 6.5 yards per carry on 17 carries. The backup, Malapea, averaged 10.5 yards per carry. USC almost ran the ball better than they threw it with their actual starting running backs. And Darnold, really drug down the rush numbers, but they were running the ball extremely successfully against Utah, and they chose not to do it. And the thing that kind of disturbs me to a certain extent is I almost feel like USC's coaching staff is trying to force Sam Darnold to be the Heisman winner. And I know teams are adjusting to the fact that Sam Darnold is the focal point of the offense, and they can it opens up the run to a certain extent. But like you said, we really haven't seen that elite level of production on Darnold. And I think that may be partially due to the fact that the coaching staff is not willing to let them run the ball enough. And I know that was a huge factor in the Washington State loss. And, the other side of it is Utah was really successful throwing the football against USC. I mean, Williams threw for 9.7 yards per attempt. And Williams has not been a very particularly good quarterback to this point in the season.
No, that's his best number on the year.
So there are a lot of red flags with USC, and where I think maybe they should have an edge, which is the fact that, they do run the ball particularly well. One, I haven't seen any indication that they're willing to stick with the run. They were almost 2-1 throwing versus running in that Utah game. And if you go back and you look at the Washington State game, it wasn't really all that different. It was 29-29, but 9 of those carries were by Darnold. We've talked a lot on this show in SEC games with the fact that every time the quarterback runs the ball, that means the running back isn't getting it. Ronald Jones ran for 9.1 yards per carry against Washington State, but he only got 14 touches. And you felt like if he got the rock over and over and over again, they probably would have been able to control the line of scrimmage. And I understand too. I mean, he had a long of 86. You have to factor that in. So he was 42 yards on 13 carries. 42 yards on 13 carries is still a solid average running the football. And they just put it too much in Darnold's hands. I mean, he gets 38 touches to Jones 14. And if you have that level, I think, of disbalance against a Notre Dame team that is pretty darn good defensively, I think the interception trend we've seen from Darnold will continue because the defense knows the quarterback's going to have the ball. They're going to tee off in the pass rush, and you get to do a lot of fun things with your linebackers and safeties where you're switching coverage and you're dropping guys out, because if you know the other team's going to run a lot, you can't drop that the outside linebacker into coverage because they may do a power run right at his gap, and while your outside linebacker is backpedaling, all of a sudden he has an offensive lineman in his face and he gets blown out of the hole. When the opposing team isn't really willing to run the ball consistently, you can do stuff like that, and it makes the job a lot harder on a quarterback. So I think that's kind of the concern. I think it's reflected in the numbers, but I also kind of think it may be a little worse than that, because whatever the statistics say, I think the coaching staff's too stubborn to probably call the game plan they should to keep themselves in this ball game.
Yeah, and you pointed out Troy Williams, 9.7 yards per attempt against USC, and I just looked at his numbers quickly for the last 2 years, which is really all that he's got in terms of a starter. He had, I think, one game in 2014. That's the best of his career. That's the best passing game he's had in his career was against this USC defense, which I think that's kind of alarming. But also, Notre Dame's got to run to win it. They're not going to throw it 47 times and put up 450 yards and win a shootout. They got to run the ball, and they need 250 plus on the ground, I think, to beat USC. The Ronald Jones not touching the ball thing is crazy to me because the guy is super talented. I mean, he's an NFL running back all day long. I don't understand it, especially when they're having that kind of production. Keep running the ball. There's even with an elite quarterback, there's so many variables and so many things that can go wrong when you drop back to pass 50 times in a game that God, if you can run the ball, you're going to win the game. So anyway, I'm going to give my score with and without Wimbush. With Wimbush, if he's healthy, I think Notre Dame wins this game somewhere like a 27-21 sort of deal. 27-21. Without him, I think they lose the game 24 27-17.
Okay, well, I think if Wimbush was healthy, I actually don't know that this game would be particularly close. I think you probably be looking like a 41-24 Notre Dame win, frankly, if Wimbush was completely healthy. Without him, I think it's closer. But I still have Notre Dame. I think you go from like 41-24 to somewhere around 31-27. I mean, Notre Dame can still hand the ball off. And I'll add this to put it in perspective. One, everything we're saying here, if you're a USC fan, please don't get too mad at us. I mean, feel free to put it in the comments, talk about your score predictions and what you think. Give us some reasons to back up why we're wrong. But I mean, it's a point of fact. USC's giving up 99% of opponent rush averages. That's pretty poor. And if you look back at this season, they haven't really played a team that could run the ball since Stanford, and Stanford had 6.5 yards per carry. Utah was, it's a particularly bad run offense, and they've 4.12 yard per carry sounds like it's a decent average to hold someone to, but they only ran for 4 yards per carry against San Jose State. They ran for less than 3 yards per carry against Arizona, and that's kind of typical of a lot of USC's opponents. So the Notre Dame run game is radically better, probably, than anything USC has faced since the early part of the season. And that Stanford game told me that teams can run really successfully. Do I think Notre Dame runs for 7 yards a carry with an injured Wimbush? No. Do they run for over 5? Probably still. And if you're able to do that, uh, I don't know. I mean, I think you can move the sticks pretty well, and you're going to probably still put up about 30 points. Maybe not the 40 plus I think they put up with a healthy Wimbush in the 7 yard per carry that would result in, but still enough points probably to outpace USC in this ball game.
The only pause I have there is for all of USC's struggles, they're 6-1, but they have struggled against a weak schedule. They're not giving up a ton of points. Now, the other way to look at that is just what you said, is opponent averages. So you're not giving up a ton of points, but you're not giving up a ton of points against teams who don't score a ton of points. So from that standpoint, I would have a little pause in terms of picking a lot of points for Notre Dame. But on the flip side, I'm arguing against myself, but they put up 38 against a good Michigan State defense. They put up 59 against a Boston College defense that isn't great, but has held other teams, good teams, to low numbers. So it's a hard game to call. Just I think a lot of us, kind of like in the SEC, we're doing with LSU and Florida, wanting them to be better than they are based on memory. I think across the country we're doing a little bit of that with USC as well. So let's do this. Let's talk about let's say that Wimbush is healthy and Notre Dame still loses. What's going to be the reason and what's going to be the takeaway for for USC if a healthy Wimbush and Notre Dame comes in and USC gets the win? What's the takeaway there? What do you think would have happened in the game for that to happen?
I think the biggest thing, if Notre Dame, I think your hypotheticals, if Notre Dame is healthy and USC wins the game, I think USC will have had to have committed to the run and run the ball and stayed balanced. Now, a lot of USC fans are going to think, well, it means Sam Darnold finally broke out and passed for a ton of yards. And that's certainly a possibility, but past performance statistics tell me that Sam Darnold is unlikely to do that. So the most likely result, if USC comes out and beats a Notre Dame team that's relatively healthy, is probably the fact that USC stayed more balanced than they have been. And again, when I say balanced, I think we're getting a little screwy now with run pass ratios because we include quarterback runs. And again, even the Washington State game where they were theoretically 29-29, it was 38 touches to Darnold and 24 touches to Jones. They need to be a lot more balanced in terms of the running backs need to get at least 40% of the touches in this ball game. And on the alternative, I guess if Notre Dame comes in and they win the game, which I think would be the next question, I think they're going to win it because they ran the ball successfully. I mean, both these teams are going to win the game if they commit to the run and they're successful with it and they throw off the run. If USC does that, I think they have a much better passer in Darnold, and they can exploit it a little bit with RPO concepts. But I also think USC is a lot more susceptible to the run, so Notre Dame can probably control the game a little bit without needing that passing game.
All right, so if we're coming out of this game and it goes the way we think it goes, and Notre Dame is 6-1, coming out of this game with a 1 loss to a Georgia team that's a legit playoff contender, how much chatter do we then hear about Notre Dame being a playoff contender? And if we hear that chatter, how legitimate do you think it would be?
I think you're going to hear a lot of chatter, especially with Miami still in the schedule. I mean, the best thing for going for Notre Dame at this point is that Miami is still undefeated, and that is a chance for a mid-November marquee win, and you've got to keep rooting for Miami to keep that schedule up. I think the injury to Chubb at NC State could be devastating for them, and that kind of hurts the strength of schedule. But Notre Dame has the schedule strength to get in with a loss, and if the only loss was to Georgia in a close game in the second game of the season, and they go undefeated, they run the table. People are going to look at how many teams they play that were ranked at the time. You're going to face probably at least 3 up to 5 ranked teams. It's talking back to 2012, completely different scenario. It's a much harder schedule. They're going to get a lot of respect for that. And I think Notre Dame still has a ton of clout, and they would end the season in this theoretically on a pretty darn impressive win streak. I mean, they would have won 10 games in a row. I don't think they can drop another game. I don't think they can lose to Miami and make it in. But if they do win this game, there's going to be a ton of chatter because everybody knows if they win that game against Miami, they're going to be heavily favored against Stanford. They're probably going to be heavily favored at this point against NC State. And they're going to, I think, a 1-loss Notre Dame. I'm not going to say they probably make it in. I think they do make it in, and I'm not sure who gets left out. But at this point, for example, I don't think Ohio State with a bad loss where they got blown out against Oklahoma necessarily makes it in over a Notre Dame team that had a close loss against a Georgia team that's probably better than Oklahoma, and will have ended the season with a pretty significant streak of wins over teams that are probably, frankly, better than who Ohio State's going to be. The big caveat there is going to hurt them is the conference championship game. It's not the clout of having won the conference. I think that's the big deal. It's the fact that teams like, say Ohio State or Penn State, if they win their division, they're going to have a chance to beat maybe undefeated Wisconsin. And whoever Georgia or Alabama is going to have the chance to beat somebody great in their championship team game. So, the biggest thing going against them is that even in the Big 12, there's been a lot of talk about how stupid it is that the Big 12 plays a championship game and how that may bite them. The flip side of that, too, is the Big 12 has a chance to get another marquee win on whoever the conference championship schedule is. And that we saw how that let Ohio State distance themselves over 2 Big 12 teams a few years ago. And that's where Notre Dame could really be impacted. And that would be an interesting question, too, because it could really spark a discussion of whether Notre Dame's football team needs to be in a conference just to give them that extra opportunity to make it into the playoff.
Yeah, and it kind of stole my thunder about what I was going to talk about on that is Notre Dame not being in a conference with a conference schedule is a double-edged sword for me. One side, I love it because you get to see them play at Georgia, then a Boston College, then a Michigan State. They don't have a lot of directional schools, gimmies on their program. They get to play the service academies. They've got this game with USC every year. They run out and play a Michigan here every once in a while. I love that because the diversity in their schedule sort of insulates them a little bit from what we're seeing with the conferences around the country. Adding those extra teams that are at the bottom of the conference, it's diluting these conference schedules and it's diluting these teams in the conferences. Really, Notre Dame is sort of insulated from that because they can pick a schedule that at even a given year is going to have 1 or 2 elite teams on it. But the flip side of that is, like you said, they're missing out on that conference championship game. And I think they are missing out a little bit on having a conference championship because we look so much at, if you win your conference, should you be in? If you don't win your conference, should you be in? Well, if you go 10-2 and then win your conference championship game in the SEC, you're going to get real consideration for being in the national championship game in a year like this, or where college football is trending in that there's no parity it's pretty crappy, and we only have a handful of elites. So I think there's some there on both not having the conference championship game and not being in a conference. So anything else on this game before we wrap it up?
I guess the one thing to sort of piggyback off that, and it's an interesting scenario. Let's say we get to the end of the season and Clemson runs the table and Miami loses a close game to Notre Dame. And then Clemson plays Miami in the ACC championship because they're in separate divisions, and Clemson blows out Miami. You're going to have two teams both with a win over Miami. You're going to have two teams with both with one loss. Notre Dame's loss is going to be to a highly ranked Georgia, but Clemson will have just blown out a team that Notre Dame sort of had issue with. It would be really, really interesting to see what the playoff committee would do with the defending national champion that had has suffered a loss in one game where their starting quarterback got knocked out to injury, but just won an extra game against a common opponent, and Clemson would have a big win over Auburn early in the year, which I think still is going to count for a lot at the end of the year. I don't know. It's just a really interesting scenario to me.
Yeah, and that's why college football is fun, and a lot more fun than pro, because a lot of this matters, and not all conferences are created equal. And I think that's where we get into a lot of the minutia and the nuances of who should get in and who shouldn't, because it's not black and white. Not all conferences are equal. Not all schedules are equal. And you have so many of these variables that come into play. All right, y'all, it's another great week for us. Fun games to talk about. SEC was lacking a whole lot this week due to some of that lack of parity we were talking about, and due to the fact that half the SEC is off this week. So I just want to say thanks for everybody for listening and watching our channel and participating in the discussion. The comments, the score predictions, they've been great lately. A lot of people really getting involved in that. So want to remind y'all again, give us your score prediction. If you liked this video, give us a like. If you didn't like it, give us a thumbs down, but also give us comments. If you loved it, we'd love a subscribe so you can listen to us. We talk bad about the SEC too, y'all. So Notre Dame fans, USC fans, hop on board. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless. I think that Notre Dame Southern Cal discussion was fantastic.